For decades, the American South has been defined by a very specific sense of heritage. It is a region where family trees are treated like sacred texts, and where many people believe their lineage is a direct, unbroken line back to the soldiers who fought in the 1860s. We have this image of an isolated, static population that stayed put, preserving a specific genetic signature for over 160 years. But a groundbreaking new study has just pulled the rug out from under that entire assumption. Geneticists recently gained access to a series of biological samples from Confederate encampments and battle sites, establishing the first-ever comprehensive DNA profile of the men who actually fought on the front lines. When they compared these results to the DNA of modern Southerners who claimed to be their direct descendants, they hit a wall of confusion. The data didn't just show a slight variation, it showed a massive unexplained disconnect. In many cases, the bloodlines of the men in the 1860s don't match any modern Southerner currently living in those same counties. The pure Southern lineage we have been told about for over a century appears to be a biological ghost. Where did the original DNA go? And who are the people actually living in the South today? The answer is a wild journey through secret migrations, forgotten identities, and a genetic reshuffling that has completely transformed the American landscape in ways no one expected. To understand why this discovery is shaking the foundations of American genealogy, we first have to look at the baseline. When scientists talk about DNA, they are looking for specific markers called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are like little flags in your genetic code that tell a story about where your ancestors were at a specific point in time. The researchers expected that the soldiers from the 1860s would show a very clear upland South or Low Country signature, mostly Scots-Irish and English clusters that had been in the region for a century. While they did find some of that, the samples revealed something much more diverse. The Confederate DNA was a chaotic mix of Mediterranean, Central European, and even surprising amounts of indigenous American markers that were never recorded on the official enlistment papers. The first shock came when they realized that the average Joe in the 1860s didn't look anything like the average Joe in the South today, genetically speaking. We often assume that because the South was an agrarian society, people stayed on their family farms for generations. But the DNA tells a story of massive volatility. The soldiers of the 1860s were often the last of their kind. After the conflict ended, a geological scale migration occurred that the history books have largely ignored. Millions of people with the original Southern DNA didn't stay in the South. They moved west, they moved north, and in many cases, they relocated to South America and Europe to escape the economic collapse of the region. This created a genetic vacuum. The people who replaced them, the people who actually built the modern South, were often newcomers who took on the names and the culture of the region so effectively that they convinced their own descendants they had been there since the beginning. This is what scientists call cultural adoption versus biological continuity. Imagine a family moves into a town in 1870. They buy a farm that used to belong to a family that left. Over 3 generations, that new family starts telling stories about their ancestors who fought in the Great Conflict, simply because they are now part of the local community. By 2024, their great-grandchildren are doing DNA tests and are baffled to find they have the wrong markers. They have the culture of the South, the accent of the South, and the pride of the South, but their blood is actually from a completely different migration wave. The researchers found that in some parts of the Deep South, up to 60% of the population has a heritage mismatch. They are Southern by heart, but migrant by DNA. The mystery deepens when we look at the hidden diversity of the soldiers themselves. One of the most fascinating findings was the presence of Melungeon signatures in the soldiers' samples. The Melungeons were a mysterious group of multiracial people in the Appalachians who were often excluded from society. However, when the pressure of the conflict grew, many of them were absorbed into the ranks. Their unique DNA, a mix of European, African, and Mediterranean, was highly prevalent in the 1860 samples. Yet when the researchers looked for that same signature in modern Southerners living in those same mountain communities today, it was almost entirely gone. It had been swashed out by later waves of migration or hidden through generations of passing as different identities. The authentic DNA of the 18th and 19th century South was far more complex than the monochrome image we have today. Another massive factor is what geneticists call the Great Dilution. After 1865, the South underwent a series of industrial booms. Thousands of workers from the North, and eventually from overseas, poured into southern cities to work in textiles, mining, and timber. These people married into old families. And within 2 generations, their specific genetic markers became dominant. Because DNA shuffles with every birth, the soldier DNA was essentially diluted into a tiny fraction of the total genome. After 5 generations, a modern Southerner might carry only 3% of the DNA from their famous ancestor. When scientists run a match, that 3% is often too small to even register against the massive 97% that comes from other places. The researchers also focused on the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA. These are parts of the code that don't shuffle. They are passed down directly from father to son or mother to daughter. This is where the mismatch became truly undeniable. In several high-profile lineages that are famous in Southern history, the modern direct descendants had Y chromosomes that didn't match the samples from the 1860s at all. This points to a silent history of non-paternal events. Whether through adoption, foster care that was never recorded, or family secrets kept to protect a reputation, the biological chain was broken repeatedly over the last century and a half. Why does this matter so much? Because for many, heritage is a foundational part of their identity. To find out that your biology doesn't match the story you were told can feel like a loss of self. But for the scientists, this is a moment of liberation. It proves that the South is not a stagnant museum of the past. It is a vibrant, evolving melting pot that has been constantly reinventing itself. The bloodlines don't match because the South is much bigger than any one era. It is a place that has absorbed millions of people from all over the world and turned them into Southerners. The DNA study proves that being Southern is a state of mind and a cultural achievement, not just a biological coincidence. One of the most surprising parts of the data revealed the Texas transfer. It turns out that a huge portion of the actual descendant DNA isn't in the South at all. It's in the West. When the conflict ended, those who carried the specific genetic markers of the 1860s soldiers often fled toward the frontier. They took their DNA to Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and even California. This left the Old South to be repopulated by people who didn't carry those specific markers. So if you are looking for the true genetic heir to a soldier from Georgia or South Carolina, you are more likely to find them in a suburb of Dallas or a ranch in Montana than you are in the original town where the soldier grew up. The geneticists also noticed a resilience pattern. The men who survived the 1860s were often the ones who had a specific genetic resistance to certain diseases that were common in army camps. These markers are very specific. When looking at modern Southern populations, these survival markers are surprisingly rare. This suggests that the families who stayed in the region faced a different set of biological pressures that favored different genetic traits over time. Essentially, the survivor DNA of the 4th moved away, while the newcomer DNA of the 4th moved in. Think about the surname trap. We put so much stock in our last names. In the South, having a name like Lee or Beauregard carries a lot of weight. But the study showed that in the chaos after the conflict, many people changed their names to avoid legal issues or to start a new life. Conversely, many people who had no relation to those famous figures adopted the names out of admiration or simply to blend in. The DNA revealed that the people with the most famous surnames often had the least amount of genetic connection to the original owners of those names. It is a stolen heritage on a biological level. Not stolen with bad intent, but adopted through the natural drift of human history. The researchers also tackled the mountain isolation myth. There is a popular idea that folks in the Appalachian and Ozark Mountains have been pure descendants for centuries because the terrain made it hard for outsiders to enter. The DNA results completely shattered this. The samples from mountain soldiers showed a massive amount of horizontal gene flow. They were mixing with travelers, traders, and different groups at a rate that was actually higher than in some coastal cities. Today's mountain residents, however, show a much more uniform genetic profile, suggesting that the isolation actually happened much later, in the early 20th century, after the original, more diverse population had already moved on. As the scientists looked at the results, they couldn't help but notice the international overlap. Some of the closest matches to the 1860 soldiers were found in populations in modern-day Brazil and Belize. This is a direct genetic link to the Confederados, the groups of Southerners who left the country after the conflict to start new colonies. Because these groups were small and intermarried within their own circle, they actually preserved the original Southern DNA better than the people who stayed in the United States. In a weird twist of biological irony, A person in a small village in Brazil might be a better genetic match for a Confederate soldier than a person living in the historic district of Richmond, Virginia. The study has also had a major impact on bioarchaeology. By mapping these soldier samples, researchers can now identify unknown remains found on old battlefields with much greater accuracy. But there was a catch. They realized that by using modern Southern DNA as a control group, they were getting false negatives. They had to stop using modern Southerners as the standard, because the modern population has shifted so much. They had to create a new historical genome based on the actual remains to act as the true yardstick. This was the moment they realized the bloodlines don't match. The yardstick and the modern population were two different sizes. For viewers interested in DNA, this serves as a massive warning about generational assumptions. We like to think of history as a series of neat, straight lines. But human history is a tangled thicket. Families don't just sit still, they explode in different directions. Secrets are kept, people are adopted, communities are replaced by economic shifts. The DNA of the South is a living example of how a culture can stay the same while the people who make it up are constantly changing. The researchers also looked into the nutritional impact on DNA expression, what we call epigenetics. They found that the extreme stressors of the 1860s left chemical scars on the DNA of those soldiers. While these aren't changes to the genetic code itself, they are changes to how the code is read. These signatures of stress can be passed down for a few generations. Interestingly, these epigenetic signatures are largely absent in modern Southerners. This suggests that the line of trauma was either broken by the departure of those direct descendants or was eventually healed through the prosperity of the later 20th century. It's another way the modern population is not a match for their predecessors. Let's talk about the Southern melting pot. We often talk about New York and Chicago as the great American melting pots, but the DNA shows that the South was doing its own version of blending for a long time. The difference was that in the South, this blending was often unofficial. It happened in the backwoods, in the coal mines, and in the small coastal ports. Because it wasn't recorded in the official history, we developed a skewed vision of what a true Southerner is biologically. The DNA Project is finally correcting that vision. It's showing us that the real Southerners of the 19th century were a diverse, mobile, and genetically adventurous group. The reaction from the Southern genealogical community has been mixed. For some, it is a fascinating new chapter in their family story. For others, it's a difficult pill to swallow. But the scientists emphasize that matching isn't the point. Biology doesn't define your worth or your connection to your home. If you feel Southern, if you love the land, and if you share the culture, you are Southern. The fact that your DNA might actually trace back to 1880s immigrants from Germany or 1920s migrants from the North doesn't change your identity. It just makes your family's journey more interesting. As we move forward, this study is going to change how heritage testing companies operate. They are going to have to start using ancient DNA from the 19th century to give more accurate results. Rather than just comparing you to other people who are alive today, we are entering an era of deep ancestry, where we can finally bypass the errors of the paper trail and see the true movements of our people. The discovery that the bloodlines don't match is not a failure of heritage. It is a testament to the American spirit of starting over. The South has been a place of rebirth for millions of people. It's a place where you can become a part of a legendary story, even if your ancestors only arrived yesterday. The soldier DNA may have moved to Texas or Brazil, and the Melungeon DNA may have faded into the background. But the idea of the South stayed put, and it was strong enough to adopt an entire new set of people. When we look at the samples from those 1860s camps, we aren't looking at modern Americans. We are looking at a different world. A world of extreme genetic diversity, high-speed migration, and deep-seated secrets. The fact that modern Southerners don't match is the ultimate proof that the South survived. It survived by evolving. It survived by taking in new blood and making it its own. A mismatch is actually a sign of life. So if you've ever done a DNA test and felt like something was missing, or that the results didn't line up with what your grandfather told you, don't worry. You are part of a massive, silent majority. You are a part of the shifting, flowing history of a region that refuses to be defined by a single category. The cracked family tree of the South is much more beautiful than the perfect one we were sold. It is a tree with roots that go all over the world. Even if the branches are all reaching for the same southern sun, researchers are still processing thousands of more samples. They are looking at the civilian DNA of the Wasashians next to see if the women and children of the South show the same mismatch as the soldiers. Initial results suggest they do. It seems that the entire original population of the colonial South has essentially dispersed, leaving a cultural template that new people have been filling in ever since. It's a ghost geography, where the names of the towns stay the same, but the people are entirely different. As we conclude this look into the South's secret DNA, remember that your code is your own. It's a map of everywhere your ancestors have been, and every choice they made. If they moved from a New York factory to a Georgia farm in 1890, they were part of the making of the modern South. Their DNA is just as Southern now as the men who were there in 1860. The shock of the researchers is just a reminder that history is never finished. We are always in the middle of a new migration, and we are always rewriting the definition of who we are. Stay curious about the science, but stay proud of your story. The bloodlines might not match, but the spirit does. And in the end, that's what really makes a people who they are. The DNA of the South is a complex, beautiful, and surprising tapestry, one that is still being woven today. The soldiers of the 14th Slanas would likely be amazed to see how far their world has traveled, and how many new people have stepped in to keep their traditions alive. The missing match is just the Earth's way of telling us that we are all travelers, and we are all just passing through on our way to becoming something new.